Hello, all, and welcome to Hoover Public Library's annual Flash Fiction event. This is our Write Club's formal, where members of our group get to showcase their talents and share a bit of their creative writing with everyone. My name is Melanie, and I'll be your host today, introducing our guests and the pieces they'll be reading for you. If you would like to learn more about our Write Club group, please email hoover.writeclub@gmail.com, visit the library's website at hooverlibrary.org, or call the fiction department at 205 444 7820. Thank you all so much for being here today and supporting your local writers. Our first presenter today is Marina REZNOR reading an excerpt from Dad's War, a nonfiction book that she wrote. Marina REZNOR is a recent transplant to Hoover, Alabama. She is an independent contemporary fiction author known for her Kingsbury Town Football Club romance series. Marina has been writing for 5 years. Last year, she published her first nonfiction work, Dad's War, a pictorial story of her father's experience in World War II as a U.S. Army medical photographer. It tells, for the first time, the engrossing story of the U.S. Army's critical mission to find enough whole blood in Great Britain to make D-Day a success. Today, she will be reading a selection from this book. Here she is.
Hello. Here is the book, Dad's War, that I published last year, and I'm going to be reading Chapter 4 to you. Chapter 4, Lady Chatterley. Labor Day 1943 in the nation's capital was hot and humid, like most late summer days. This was not a surprise, since Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp, an early example of political compromise between the northern and southern states. Air conditioning was unheard of, and fans were the only source of cooling. As the least senior member of the 2nd Medical Detachment Museum and Medical Arts Service, Dad was assigned to spend the holiday weekend on duty at the Walter Reed. Everyone else had left the city for the Maryland beaches or the mountains to the west. As he told it, I was in the lab when a call came through that the body of a deceased serviceman had been returned from Europe and needed a military escort to his home. I was told to escort the body. I had only been in the Army 2 months and had no idea how to go about this. So I went to the quartermaster's office for more details. The sergeant on desk duty took one look at me and cursed. It turned out that the deceased had been a technical surgeon, 5th class, and the military escort needed to be of equal or greater rank. I was a private 1st class. Since there was no one else to go, I was given an immediate promotion to that rank, which entailed a stack of paperwork. The sergeant then took me through the protocol of escorting the body, emphasizing that I was to make sure the family had transportation to the funeral and home because it was wartime and gasoline was rationed. I asked if I should hire a taxi, and his face got red. No, he said, you take them in your Jeep. I told him I didn't have a Jeep. He pulled out more forms and slapped them on the desk. Then requisition one and a driver. I was provided with a new uniform and orders for a Jeep and driver. The driver was Harry Lackey, a nice guy from New Jersey, and he picked me up in Bethesda, and together we drove to Union Station across from the Capitol. Harry supervised loading the coffin onto the train, and we began the trip to El Paso, Texas. A Jeep and hearse were waiting for us in El Paso. We attended the funeral, and the family insisted we stay for the get-together afterwards. That night, Harry and I got on the train back to Washington, D.C., and Harry drove us back to Bethesda. It had felt cooler in El Paso than in Washington. Back at the Walter Reed, I went to the desk sergeant to return the Jeep and driver. He looked at me like I was crazy. Howard, he said, there is one rule in the United States Army and one rule only. When you get something, you never, ever give it back. Dad was now a technical sergeant with a Jeep, a driver, and an associated bump up in pay. Harry was assigned to the 2nd Mamas, and they nicknamed their permanently requisitioned Jeep Lady Chatterley. They also discovered that they shared a mutual love of sightseeing. Their first planned outing, a day trip to Mount Vernon with some nurses, ran into an immediate problem. Gasoline was scarce, and it took several ration carts to fill up Lady Chatterley. The ration cards were printed by the U.S. Office of Price Administration on special paper, which was also rationed. Dad hit upon an ingenious solution. Because the 2nd Medical Detachment Museum and Medical Arts Service developed and printed pictures that were then used for medical school instruction, they were permitted to requisition paper. Dad requisitioned the paper that the gas ration coupons were printed on, and then photographed a blank ration card, which they used to print their own. Through the winter and spring, Dad and Harry enjoyed local sightseeing trips in Lady Chatterley until June 1943, when the call came that they were being shipped overseas.
Thank you so much, Marina. That was lovely. All right. So next up, we have Skylar Randall, who will be reading an excerpt from his fiction novel, The Good Doctors. Skylar Randall is a self-published author specializing in crime mysteries and thrillers. His first novel, titled Jacqueline Willoughby, was published in 2017, followed in 2019 by the prequel titled Reina, and his new book, Francis Laurent, will be released April 5th. Skylar resides in McCalla, Alabama with his wife Yvette and their West Highland Terrier, Q. Skylar will be reading an excerpt from his manuscript, The Good Doctors. Robert Madigan, a promising University of Pennsylvania medical student, feels forced to leave school to care for his family after his father's untimely passing. As he prepares for his departure, his professor connects him to a man who offers him a lucrative alternative: become a paid-for-hire killer. The excerpt that Skylar is going to read is titled My Fellow Conspirators and takes place after Robert has approached Samuel and Clark individually, and each has agreed to be part of this venture. Now the three get together and meet to start the beginning of The Good Doctors.
Good morning, my fellow conspirators. Saturday morning, the air was cold but deathly still at the lake, where an impenetrable fog hung, obscuring anyone and anything more than a few feet away. Robert understood why Clark had chosen this location. It offered the ultimate security. With Samuel at his side, Robert approached the edge of the lake, pulling up the collar of his overcoat and adjusting his toboggan cap further over his ears to protect him from the cold. Samuel did the same. Clark was sitting in a little weather-beaten boat, peacefully reading a book, as if they weren't about to discuss murder. Good morning, Clark. Clark looked up and smiled broadly. My fellow conspirators, please come aboard my yacht. A 15-foot dinghy, Samuel said with a laugh, is hardly a yacht. Robert climbed aboard first, noting that Clark was wearing a finely knit wool sweater and light pants that would have been more appropriate for a real yacht. Unlike his friends, he didn't wear a cap against the cold. Instead, he seemed to revel in it. As Samuel climbed aboard, nearly stumbling, as boats were simply not in his realm, Clark removed his rimless glasses and stowed his book safely inside his small leather satchel. Good morning, mates, he called out with an exaggerated pirate's dialect. Ahoy, Captain, Samuel replied, immediately catching on. He and Robert sat side by side on the slatted seat, as from the stern, Clark pushed them off and rowed. They drifted off into a different world, far from the lectures and campus rigmarole. Here, engulfed in a fog bank, Robert felt as if they were floating in limbo, utterly separate and apart from anyone and anything. He thought he would remember this moment as the time when he could finally take action that could guarantee, just as Clark's life was guaranteed, the future he desired. How Clark knew to stop rowing before hitting the far bank was a mystery to Robert, as everything was all but invisible in the fog. But he stopped regardless, securing the oars horizontally and letting the boat drift. Clark reached under his seat and removed a small wooden chest inlaid with gold. Robert thought the thing impressively gaudy, but he kept his opinion to himself. Clark opened the chest, revealing a bottle of brandy and 3 tulip glasses resting on a red velvet bed. Robert wondered if he had other chests as perfectly arranged for 2 or 4 people. Gentlemen, Clark handed them both glasses. This is one of the finest brandies I've ever enjoyed. I'm sure you'll agree. He poured quarter glasses for his friends and then himself, and put the bottles back in the velvet bed. Shall we begin? Robert hesitated. He didn't often conduct meetings, and even though he was the catalyst to this one, the circumstances were challenging. How do we plan a murder? Clark, more comfortable with leadership, got things going without a moment's hesitation. Running things, after all, was already in his blood. Robert had already explained to both men the tales of Professor Howell and Gavin Knoll, so the preliminaries weren't necessary. It seems to me, Clark said, that we are simply accommodating the wealthy and fulfilling their need for retaliation against those who offend them. Is that correct? Samuel rolled his eyes, seemingly irritated with Clark's overblown prose. Robert clarified, against those who commit serious wrongs against them. Wrongs? Samuel asked. As I said, unsavory individuals. Clark smiled as he sipped his brandy. Sounds subjective. I trust Professor Howell, Robert assured him. It's not our place to ask questions, only to follow orders, to provide a service, and get paid handsomely, Samuel added. Robert took a sip of his brandy. I'll receive the name and location of the target from the professor. It's your job to accomplish the preliminaries. Clark will use his considerable interpersonal skills to befriend the patient. Samuel chuckled at the term. Robert continued, he'll determine the patient's routine to assist us in planning the operation. You mean the hit? Clark asked. Robert nodded. You and Samuel will work together to develop a plan for detaining said patient so I can complete the procedure. Samuel smiled, detaining said patient. You are a word master, Robert. Clark nodded in agreement, holding up his brandy. To the word master. The three clinked their glasses together. Robert took another sip, savoring it a bit longer this time. This is good stuff. I'm here to teach you the finer things in life, said Clark. Robert considered that, adding, and I'm here to teach you the unsavory things in life. Clark raised his brandy again. To the unsavory. They clinked their glasses again and shared a good laugh. After a short interlude to enjoy their brandies, the three men got to work. I have to say, said Clark, that death by injection is quite a creative choice. It seems right, Robert said, though they will have a choice. A choice? Samuel laughed. The professor has already sent along a package with an alternative option. Another option? Samuel shook his head. A handgun. Clark shrugged. That would seem much more efficient. Is it? There's the sound, the damage, the mess. Samuel, always the mortician, nodded at that. I would prefer we leave a clean presentation. You would, Clark laughed. Would you like to leave a signed death certificate as well? Perhaps including your address, should they have any questions? A calling card, should others require your services? Robert said, good doctors should always offer the patients a choice, I think. To die or not to die? No, Clark, how to die. They'll know their sentences before it's carried out. I'll simply give them the dignity of choosing the methodology. Dignity? That might be an overstatement. A bit of dignity, Robert conceded, holding his thumb and forefinger an inch apart. A little dignity? Clark and Samuel both nodded, and Clark said, much more fitting. As Clark refilled their glasses, Robert concluded their meeting. Gentlemen, we're doing as far beyond the typical demands and requirements of the medical profession, but we should still remain true to our calling. We shall, at all times, be good doctors. Clark held up his glass. To the good doctors. Samuel and Robert returned the toast. The good doctors. They clinked their glasses together once again. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Skylar. It was chilling. Next up, we have Beth Stewart reading her short story, Alfie. Along with all the regular stuff, like a bachelor's from Auburn, a master's from South Alabama, and now a retired teacher with amazing grown children, Beth did a few interesting things that she likes to write about. She's told us about changing her name and intends to write all about getting her tattoo for her 65th birthday. A few years ago, she wrote a children's book of historical fiction entitled My Sister's Hoy, which is available in the children's department of the Hoover Library. Today, she will read an essay about a difficult decision she had to make when she moved here from Daphne.
This is the story about Alfie. After Hurricane Ivan blew through Daphne, Alabama on September the 16th, 2004, I discovered a small black kitten in my backyard, shaken and very disoriented. She looked to be not much more than 5 or 6 weeks old, but she had lived through a Cat 3 hurricane, and as I learned later, had been seen huddled down in a pile of tires behind a car dealership on 59, Alabama 59, behind my neighborhood. I guess that says something about her strength, her stamina, and her desire to live. I named her Alfie. Alfie was a feral, and it took me a while, but I finally coaxed this tiny kitten to come up into my laundry room and eat some food. The local cat coalition informed me that I would probably never be able to touch her because she was feral, but that my feeding her was still a blessing. I decided I would keep trying. Every evening when I got home from work, Alfie would come around when she heard my garage door opening. I would have food for her in the laundry room, and I kept moving it closer and closer to me as I sat there. When she began to eat one night, I leaned over and scratched her head while she ate. She purred. Eventually, Alfie made the connection between me, the food, and the good feeling of being scratched on the head. We bonded. I named her Alfie after the movie, the remake with Jude Law that had just come out that summer. I never even saw it, but the original song by Dionne Warwick was always one of my lifelong favorites. I didn't care if she was a girl, she was Alfie. Alfie became my cat. She stayed outside all day, and as soon as I drove up and raised that garage door, she would hear it and come around. I set up a litter box and bed in the garage, and she stayed there often. But there were times when she still heard the call of the wild. Once Alfie was gone for 6 days, and I decided she had disappeared for good. I was literally packing up her bed when I saw her running down the drive, as skinny as could be. I didn't realize how much I loved her until she came running toward me that day. In 2006, I made the decision to move. In 2006, I made the decision to move to Birmingham to be near my children. I sold my home and began the packing and moving process. My plan was to let Alfie do her thing. We would get packed, I would finish up, and then bring her with me to Birmingham. But cats don't take change so easily. That afternoon, once the movers had left and the place was an empty mess, Alfie came in and became very agitated and quite upset. She ran out, obviously distressed. I finished the cleaning, went to the closing, and came back, hoping to find Alfie hanging around. She was nowhere to be found. I had planned to go to Birmingham that night, but stayed with a friend instead, hoping to find Alfie the next morning and then head out. But this is the way it works with cats. I never saw her the whole day. The painters came around my house and started doing various kinds of work for the new owner. I hovered around and even took a walk and sat on my old front steps for a while. One guy walked out and gave me a weird look. I said, hey, and asked him if he had seen a black cat. He shook his head, no. I spent the day in total misery, needing to go to Birmingham, but not wanting to leave my cat. I walked back and forth along the back drive of the neighborhood, calling for Alfie. The workers at the house were starting to look at me funny. I realized I was going overboard. I could not keep doing this. It was time to go. I could not keep searching for Alfie. I had to go to Birmingham. I showered and I packed my things. I began loading my bags into the car, but in the process, keys in hand, I walked out and the door shut behind me. I heard the click. I was locked out. Half of my stuff, including my purse, was still in my friend's home, and he was at work and not due home until later that night. After all the stress of losing my cat, now I was locked out and couldn't leave until I had my purse and other things. but thankfully I did have my car keys. I sat there in my car, waiting for my friend to return home, thinking about the craziness of what I had been through. Yes, I hated to leave my cat, but it was time for me to let her go. I started the car just to get a little AC and listen to music as the sun went down over the bay. And then I had the thought, I'm sitting here in my car. What else do I have to do? I'm going to drive down to my house one last time. I drove slowly around to the back of the house, and there, to my surprise, and as bright as day, was the garage, door up, light on. My garage, or rather, what used to be my garage. The painters must have left the door up. I sat there for a moment, stunned, really, looking at it, and then I did it. I slowly drove down into what used to be my garage. It was totally empty, quiet, surreal, and very, very bright. Over on the wall was the door opener closer. I stared at it for a moment and thought, that sound was what always brought Alfie around. Should I try it? I quietly opened my car door and stepped out, looked around. This was not my house anymore. Should I be doing this? I went over to the opener closer. If I tap this thing and then it suddenly locks me in here, what do I do? I'll be locked in a house that I don't own anymore. I'll probably end up going to jail. And then I thought about Alfie. She always came running when I opened that garage door. I did it. I tapped the opener closer. The door started going down. My heart was pounding. I tapped it again. It stopped. And then it slowly began opening back up. Thank God. Thank God I was not locked in. I stood for a second in the bright fluorescent light of my former garage and then went and sat back in the car, leaving the door open. Not sure what I thought would happen, but I just sat. And then I heard it. A meow. I couldn't believe it. I was almost afraid to look around, but I did. And there she was, Alfie, rubbing against the back tire of the car, looking at me like, where in the world have you been and what is going on? I stepped out ever so quietly and picked her up and held her next to me. I said, Alfie, I have you, and now we are going to Birmingham. We sat down in the car and I shut the door as quietly as I could so as not to scare her. I had my cat and we were going off to our brand new life. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That was very sweet. Next up, we have Michael Verga reading some poems. The first one will be The Heart is Not Earthbound, followed by some haikus and micropoems. Youngest son of Vincent and Virginia Ruth, Michael Verga received his Bachelor of Arts in English from Birmingham Southern College, also his father's alma mater. At age 30, Michael dedicated himself to his calling, poetry. For this, he credits his grandmothers who nurtured his natural creativity. 33 years later, he hopes he is aging artistically, and as a young senior citizen, as he likes to call himself, he can often be found reading and writing in the computer lab at the Hoover Senior Center. Michael has participated triennially in flash fiction since 2009 and returns with his 5th presentation of poetry. He is thankful that through the Hoover Library's Write Club program, he can share his creativity with the community.
Well, the first piece is on hard copy, so I'll try to read at the same time, pull up the shorts. Okay, so Rilke, R-I-L-K-E, he is a German language poet, and it just so happens that earlier this week I came across a quote of his that I would like to superscript my reading with. It is spring again. The earth is like a child that knows poems by heart. The heart is not earthbound. 1. Brontë on the rocks. Strong wheel, winds, rains, moors, crags, definitive high rock opera before the art went high tech. 2. King of Pain. Heathcliff, novel study on the keen scent of male grief, the weathering howls, reign of mad dog. 3. Kindred spirits make guest appearances. Stoker's Count Dracula, inspired after Bronte's Heathcliff. Real supernaturals don't die. The soul mates never out of print. Brontë Beyond Bound books. In creating Heathcliff, Emily's reincarnated herself. 5. Art imitating everlasting life. Heathcliff, would you like to step up into the air? Kathy, always. Promises are always. 6. The heights beyond the weathering. He wails, Kathy, my love, come back. Instead, their heart forwards those two out of that house for home. The heart is not earthbound. Left panel, the west. Slowing Niagara Falls down to a freeze frame. Slowing Niagara Falls down to a freeze frame. East panel, the face lifted off the clock. The face lifted off the clock. The carpenter's son pulling all together many broken pieces. The carpenter's son pulling all together many broken pieces. Both hands need to be gloved, the right and the left. Both need to be gloved, the right and the left. Spring, the monarch butterfly has captured me. The monarch butterfly has captured me. The fever refuses to break. Green is a primary color on the wheel. Green is a primary color on the wheel. Well, thank you for letting me participate again. Hope to return in 3 more years.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was lovely. Haikus are such a wonderful format. All right. Next up, we have Haley Moon reading her short story, Death and the Beautiful Lady. Haley is an Alabama native and self-described crazy cat lady in training. She has 2 of her poems, Damaged Wings and Untitled, published in her alma mater's literary magazine, The Filibuster, during her freshman and junior years at the University of Auburn at Montgomery. When she is not making drugs from 8 to 5, the FDA-regulated ones, blogging on social issues, or crocheting to stay sane, she is out seeking inspiration. Haley is currently working on a collection of short stories that explore the personification of death, as well as a novel on the rise and fall of a ruthless female drug lord. So, take it away, Haley.
It was well past midnight, and Anne sat at her vanity, reminiscing on husbands, friends, parents, and even children that had passed on. She didn't know why those thoughts had been with her for the past week, but what lied beyond had been on her mind. She had been surprised to see him in the lobby, looking around at the fixtures and the paintings that hung on the wall. It was the same smile he had given that night many years ago. At the time, she had only been around 22, but she was well over 80 now. Excuse me. And yet he had not changed. his frame thin but strong, his presence cold but not intimidating. It was the kind of cold that chilled to the bone and yet left your flesh as hot as embers. She felt it now as she heard the hinges of the bedroom door creak as it opened. Did you tell Charles about me when I stopped by earlier today? She laughed and continued running the brush through her hair. Of course not. How do you tell someone death stopped by? She turned to look at him and then back in the mirror. She stopped and stared, looking where his reflection should have been. The mirror. She stopped her soft strokes and turned to face him once again. You don't have a reflection. You're standing right here. She pointed at the floor to emphasize her point before turning back to the mirror. And yet I can't see you. He smiled. I am but a shadow. I cast no image in your looking glass. She placed the brush on the vanity and once again faced him. Well, why are you here? Last time you were here, you were coming for Mr. Henry. Are you coming for someone else? Please, maybe? Her daughter told me she's pretty bad off now. They slapped her in a nursing home about 2 weeks ago. She looked expectantly, waiting for him to reply. No, Anne. This time I have come for you. Her face fell. Well, I thought I had more time. I'm not ready. She stood and began to pace, her hands at her hip. No, Anne, you are at the end of your time. As for your readiness, that is not my concern, I'm afraid. She sat on the edge of the bed. Can you at least visit with me for a little while? Like we did many years ago? He sat on the small chest across from her. Of course. She looked off into the distance, solemn, before she brought her gaze to rest on him. He was just like he had been before, thin, his hands long and folded, and his face keen, cold. She had thought him a sick man that night he had come to her dressing room and stood at the threshold. But the coat he wore was heavy, and she could tell he was strong, his wide shoulders nearly touching the doorway. Anne stared at him, and he returned her gaze, the corners of his lips turned upward slightly. You have questions for me, Anne? She chuckled. You know I always do. Her nerve began to crumble, and Anne gripped her nightgown, scrunching up the delicate fabric. She looked serious and frightened. I'm afraid. I understand. I would be surprised if you weren't. Is there some way you can let me stay a little longer? You know, for my family? The shake of his head was slow. I can't do that. Why not? Anne spoke softly. I don't have the power nor the authority to extend your life beyond this allotted time. Then who does? Tears rimmed her eyes. She quickly looked down, embarrassed. He raised his hand, his long index finger pointing up toward the ceiling. He does. He stated simply and brought his hand down to his lap. She nodded, seeming to understand, and wiped the stray tear that trailed down her cheek. All those years ago, what made you come to my dressing room? It wasn't my time then, and yet you came. I wanted to see the woman that everyone talked about. I wanted to see this marvelous creature for myself. So I was in the neighborhood for Henry Etheridge. She finished the sentence for him. He smiled. Yes, Henry Etheridge, your neighbor. And I thought I'd like to meet her. You know, the dead do talk. Silence permeated the air, and Anne wiggled her toes to see if she was still alive. She looked over at him, and he stared, the same small smile on his face. It was the picture of patience, and that unnerved her. Where will you take me once? You know, I will merely assist with the crossover. As for the journey to the beyond, another will come for you. Who will come for me? That I cannot say. It depends, Anne, on whether you have lived your life in the light or in the darkness. It is not for me to judge. I only collect. Anne shook her head and sighed. You know, I hate to admit it, but I don't want to die. I don't want to leave my son. Is that wrong of me? No, Anne, it's not. Don't get too attached to this life. It is only a moment, a flicker in your eye. Blink and it's over. You know, I wrote about you in my journal. I wanted to tell people about you. but I didn't have the words. What are the words one can find or use to describe a conversation with something that is all around, but no one can see? No one would have believed it. They sat for another hour before the man disrupted the silence. "And it's time." Tears welled up in her eyes once again, and she stood pointing her finger at him. "You said you would let me know when you were coming back, that you weren't going to come like some thief in the night after me. I think you lied, mister." He sighed. "Oh, no, Anne. I kept my promise to you that night. You remember? That night you sang and danced, and everyone in town watched you perform. They loved you. They really did. When I came for Henry, I made a detour and came to your door. You remember how we talked that night and we laughed? I did not lie. I cannot lie. When I told you that I would give you signs that I was on my way back, I kept my word." He cocked his head to one side, watching her as she stared down at the floor, deep in thought to the night they had first met. "What signs were you supposed to give me?" "Well, it wasn't necessarily me that gave them to you, but rather my counterpart. Time, the process of aging. And let me tell you a little secret: you and everyone around you have been dying since you were born. I come to deliver that final blow. But those signs were simple but significant. Those glasses on the nightstand are a result of your vision failing you, the dye in your medicine cabinet to cover the grays, the creams to unfold the wrinkles around your eyes, the ache in your knees and back were the signs that I was coming. You didn't pay attention. It's your time, Anne. It's time for you to make the journey." He extended his hand, smiling, and the old woman sighed, her shoulders sagging as she sat on the bed. She was somewhere in between two realms. Anne was not asleep nor awake when it hit. The numbness in her arm, the fullness in her chest, the pain that spread throughout her body, and then it faded. Anne couldn't remember when the coldness had crept in, and she sat up in disbelief as she felt herself being pulled from her body. And then she saw him, the man from before, the one that had entered her dreams every night for the past week. She squeezed his hand as he helped her to her feet. She was flooded with warmth and the pain from before forgotten, and somehow she knew she was no longer in her body. And she made to turn before he gently grabbed her chin, bringing her gaze back to him. "Don't look back, Anne." He took her hand in his, and the two walked together as he shepherded her toward the light. All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you, Haley. Next up, we have Nancy Dorman Hickson reading an excerpt from The Time That Follows, part of her memoir. Nancy Dorman Hickson is originally from Mississippi, but has lived in Birmingham for decades. She was a features editor with Progressive Farmer and Southern Living for many years and is now a freelance writer. She is also the co-author of Diplomacy and Diamonds, the memoir of Joanna King Herring, a Texas woman portrayed by Julia Roberts in the Tom Hanks movie Charlie Wilson's War. Nancy is reading a nonfiction piece titled The Time That Follows, excerpt from her in-progress memoir.
Thank you. The time that follows. Daddy makes my younger sister Mary and me go to school the day after we bury Mama. To him, it makes no sense to wallow in grief. He is tough on my siblings and me, on others, and on himself. Even at age 14, I recognize the gruffness hides his devastation at losing the love of his life. Years later, my brother Dennis told me that during that terrible time of our mourning, Daddy had shown up at his apartment, unannounced, at all hours, crying and sitting amid the renovations Dennis and his partner were always in the midst of. We didn't talk, Dennis recalls. He'd just cry. That is a side of Daddy I didn't recognize. But he is tough too, and he expects his children to be as well. The weekend after Mama died and was buried, he drops Pete and me off at school the following Monday before the 8:30 a.m. start of class, then takes himself to his job at the bank. I walk from the car straight to the bathroom, ignoring other students as I pass. I've forgotten my coat, but I don't feel the uncharacteristic cold of this January Mississippi morning or hear the chatter of kids. Instead, I imagine a neon sign attached to me, announcing in flashing lights my pariah status among the other high school students: motherless, grieving, danger. I feel their eyes upon me and imagine I hear whispers once I'm not directly in front of them. Shuffling past, head down, I settle myself in the last bathroom stall, trying to make myself invisible. With my books clutched in front of me like a shield, I stare straight ahead and wait for classes to start. The bathroom door opens, followed by the sound of two girls babbling in front of the mirror. They don't approach the stalls beside me. Instead, I hear them rumbling in their bags, then smacking their lips to freshly applied lipstick. "Wasn't it terrible about Mrs. Dorman?" one of them says. "I know," the other replies, her voice dropping to a whisper. I imagine her look of exaggerated horror reflected in the mirror. "Do you think Nancy will be in school?" "I doubt it," the other one answers. I am afraid to move. I cringe and clutch my books tighter, filled with self-loathing at being the focus of their pity. When the bell rings for the first class, I continue sitting in my bathroom hideaway, waiting until I hear the door whoosh behind them, then giving them enough time to move out of sight down the hall before I emerge. I wash my hands out of habit, delaying. The neon sign blinks loudly. My presence seems a hardship to everyone I encounter. I stumble through a few classes, staring down at my desk at my paper or my book, unable to hear anything but the rush in my ears. Next, I sit in study hall at the school library where the table has filled up after I sat down alone. Most of the kids around me are ignoring me, talking about the game on Friday and how they think they did on a test. My ninth grade science teacher, Mrs. Scarborough, approaches. Outside of the classroom, I surmise she might be a bird watcher or a chess player because she looks the part. She wears dowdy clothes in grays and browns, sensible black flat-footed shoes, no jewelry, and an unadorned face. Her look is a distinct contrast from most heavily made up and fashionable Mississippi females with whom I am familiar. As we say in the South, Mrs. Scarborough is not from around here. She is tall and slender with a salt and pepper bun she keeps bobby pinned in place. Wiry wisps of black and white strands constantly escape and billow around her thin face as she stands at the front of the class, writing quickly with chalk on the blackboard as she tries to explain obscure scientific principles to a room full of uninterested teenagers. Before being in her class, I had never had any interest in science. Mrs. Scarborough, however, challenges me. I study for her far more than I have for any previous teacher, moved by her passion for the subject. Rumor has it some parents have complained about the amount of work she gives. A year from now, the rumors prove true, and she will no longer be at the school. After Mrs. Scarborough's departure, various coaches fulfill their contractual obligations by teaching science classes when they aren't on the football or baseball field or basketball court. I lose my budding interest in science. Years later, I think of Mrs. Scarborough when my daughter switches from a creative writing major at the arts high school she attends to a college major of neuroscience. In the days before my mother died, I stay at my friend Beth's house and we studied together for Mrs. Scarborough's test scheduled today after study hall. While we are studying, Beth's father comes to the door. "It's time for y'all to turn out the lights and go to sleep," he says. At my house, I'm allowed to stay up as late as I need to study. After he leaves, I creep into Beth's closet, close the door, turn on the light, and continue studying. Burying myself in my notes in the textbook is how I've kept thoughts at bay of my mother in a hospital 2 hours away. When Mrs. Scarborough approaches the table in study hall, I grow nervous. I'm surrounded by my peers who have not known how to talk to me about what happened to my mother. By silent agreement, we stick to questions about safe topics, not queries about subjects about which none of us have answers. The teacher leans in and places her hand on my back. I squirm at her kindly gesture. Then she delivers an unintended blow. "How is your mother?" she asks. For the next few years, I will walk around a shell of a person, primarily able only to feel pain and loss and sorrow, going through the motions of living. I will wallow in grief as only a teenager who has not learned the art of defense against life can wallow. I will have no armor to protect myself from the unrelenting grief that will consume me. I will be devastated by my mother's death. But on this day, my wounded psyche has yet to crumble into depression. At this point, I am merely an injured creature, bleeding, but trying to deny the hurt even exists. Mourning has not sunk marrow deep and mired me in a sadness that will eventually lead me to the brink of death. Now, only a few days after Mama's passing, I am winging it without a blueprint on how to be an insecure teenager whose mother has inconveniently died. So I answer my teacher's question flippantly when I am feeling anything but. I giggle. "Oh, she died," I chirp. It is a lying laugh. Mrs. Scarborough stammers, "I'm so sorry," instant tears pooling in her warm brown eyes. I didn't know. "Well, obviously, you don't have to take the test." To that, my response is fierce. "No," I say, "I have to take the test." I have spent long hours at Beth's house drawing images of molecules and neutrons and protons and thinking about how those particles merge, collide, and move. By immersing myself in study, I escape thinking for a few hours about how my own world is exploding. I refuse to think about how my mother, the centripetal force that held our family orbiting together, is breathing her last breath on this earth. Now she's somewhere in a universe far, far away from me, a place as distant and unknown as the unseen, elusive quark. On Mrs. Scarborough's test, I answer even the bonus points correctly. My final score is 110, a personal best. But as I stare at the perfect score scrawled across the top in blue ink, I feel only emptiness. I am too young to envision it completely, but even then, I catch a glimpse of my future, a series of life's big moments, of life's big tests, my wedding day, the birth of my twins, my brother's death, all without my mother's loving face to rejoice or sorrow with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That was a heart-wrenching story about all the different forms that grief can take. Last but not least, today we have Sean DeArmand's The Core of PSD. This is a fiction piece that he did. He is not here with us today. He's at work, but he sent us a recording. So I will be putting that up on the screen. Sean has been a library staff member for 12 years at the Hoover Library and has received his Master of Library and Information Science degree. The graduate school program required him to read and summarize way too many academic articles, a process which made it clear that most people who write academic articles are doing so against their will. This inspired him to write a fictional version of one such article and present it in dissertation format. In the state of mind he imagines countless months of research on an uninteresting topic might provoke. Here then is the core of PSD.
The role of the proliferate system designer in the history of the great information superconductor is often met with nearly as much disdain as the superconductor itself. The PSD is a collection of thoroughly minded individuals whose sole purpose did in fact originate with the noblest of intentions, i.e. to analyze a living system, comprehend it, and provide a plan for simplification and efficient functionality. To date, the collective has yet to demonstrate any results of that third goal, and claims of either of the first two goals' success remain inconclusive, as there is nobody who isn't part of the collective capable of analyzing and or comprehending the collective's analysis and or comprehensions. As such, the value of the proliferate system designers remains ambiguous. The effect, on the other hand, is quite concrete, and one need and or dare look no further than humanity's entrance into what we laughably refer to as the information age. Since the birth of cognitive thought, there has been an unquestionable inclination towards mental overload, probably. From the moment communication was granted ease of access to various outlets, penmanship, typeface, audio recording, tattoo parlors, the potential for information overload reared its stupid head. When it comes to the isolated overload of the individual, known colloquially as intellectual noise, at least in this publication, the remedy is as simple as a few weeks of bed rest combined with healthy doses of raw opium. But in the case of the freaking system, a complex web of individuals, each believing themselves to be the sole exception, the information overload leaves a financial, social, and emotional impact on the system as a whole. The fundamental problem, as it were, or was, I can never keep that straight, is the circular reasoning behind recorded history. Once something is written down, its having been written down also becomes a measurable fact. And when a system begins recording its own process of recording, the already subjective sense of assigning value to information becomes irrelevant. For an illustration of the global threat, one need look no further than the 2011 abstract, The International War on Moroncy. In fact, not much further than the title. The potential for overload was first recorded in the early 1970s when the archives of Congress demanded simplification of all material available. Enter the proliferate system designers who created the response program in response, that's what they called it, to begin the arduous process of going through all available records, which they recorded. To say the least about the results, one would have to have shut up decades ago, and even then it wouldn't have mattered. As it became clear over the next 3 years that the complexity of intellectual noise was worsening, the proliferate system designers pretended to place confidence in the idea of an expansive Council on Redundancy Elimination, or CORE, as it came to be forgotten, to sort through the mess. Made up of a hearing committee, which did exactly what it sounded like, a magistrate to oversee stuff, and all votes being decided by an 11-seat entity called the Board of Chairs, because proliferate system designers aren't very creative. On March 8, 1976, the first joint session between the Board of Chairs and the hearing committee was held in the Louis Isaac Memorial Atrium, whoever that was. Walter P. Simmons was appointed, behind his back, to the position of magistrate. 2 days later, Magistrate Simmons received his first notice for suspension, having not shown up for 2 days' worth of meetings, the irony being lost on the entire council. There was a call to remove Magistrate Simmons from his position, presumably from him. The Board of Chairs voted it down with a margin of 8-3, thus with no speaker on the floor and nothing for the hearing committee to hear. The rest of the meeting continued about as well as you'd imagine. Of note was the committee member who pantomimed a request to end the meeting early, which was voted down by the board with a margin of 6-5. By August of 1976, 15 meetings had been held in silence when Magistrate Simmons made a surprise appearance at the atrium to submit his letter of resignation. The board voted against it with a margin of 9-3, the extra vote being from the atrium's bookkeeper who had just poked her head in to say hi. Self-evidence suggested the council's model was ineffective. And Magistrate Simmons called for a restructuring, which was voted down by the board with a margin of 6-1. The remaining 4 members had nodded off. Simmons then called for the Board of Chairs to shove itself, which was unanimously voted down by a margin of 1 member's finger. The secretary of something we'll figure out later, who up until that point had been keeping track of the minutes by hatch marks, took it upon himself to collocate what he felt were the council's primary inefficiencies, the full documentation of which would eventually appear in Gorman's annotated anthology of unabridged footnotes index, now available on ebook and ASMR. According to Professor R.G. Labrador in his introduction on page 93, an early draft of the document found its way into the possession of the Commission on Inefficiency Negation, or COIN, just because. Based on this commission's advice, which nobody asked for, the Council on Redundancy Elimination agreed to host the Proliferate System Designers Convention of 1978, which attracted the top minds in the field of information analysis, as well as the slightly less than top minds, several hundred who overestimated themselves and some of their friends. The convention proved to be such a success for everyone not in attendance that a second one was fast-tracked, and then delayed to become also the Proliferate System Designers Convention of 1978 of 1981. As morbid fascination with PSD-Con reached a global audience, the Commission on Inefficiency Negation, now the special guest of its own convention, was relegated to using the same space as the Council on Redundancy Elimination. A decision nobody will admit to was made to rename both entities as the Commission on Eliminating Redundant Council Inefficiency of Negation, as it was the only way to combine both coin and core into a single 8-letter word. Unfortunately, that word was coercion, and the task of reversing the decision became the primary goal of the Proliferate System Designers Conventions of 1982 through 2005. By 2006, the expenditure of the convention seemed to have outlasted its practicality. This, combined with an increase in publicly inappropriate Melville Dewey cosplayers, prompted a proposition to expunge proliferate system designers and everything they ever stood for, wrote, or made eye contact with from the Council's ipseity. And yes, that is a word grammarly. The proposition was deposited in front of the Board of Chairs via brick and subsequently disacknowledged with a margin of 9.3 to 1 stick in a used banana peel. In fact, in 1983, history records the only time the Board of Chairs ever voted yes. Due to copier malfunction, the daily agenda had been printed backwards. The meeting opened with the farewell address, followed by those opposed and then in favor before the situation was rectified. Had they managed to go 10 measly seconds longer, the unpresented motion surely would have carried. In 2007, the future of the Council on Redundancy Elimination was brought into question when Magistrate Walter P. Simmons shot himself in the head during the November meeting's welcome and announcements. A motion was put forth to have him removed from his position, which the board voted on, the results of which were never recorded, but provoked the hearing committee into taking action to overturn the board physically. The magistrate's final act was carried on the floor and then off it. 2 months later, he was dug up for the appeal and reinstated. The temporary magistrate, who had been acting as temporary magistrate, and quite well, proposed that the Board of Chairs be disbanded permanently, although nobody bothered to call for a vote. They got one anyway. It was shot down with a margin of 100 million and billion and 7 to 3. In response, the council stenographer called for a vote ensuring that the board be allowed to continue to vote, which they voted against, leaving the council in a state of legal conundrum. As of this writing, the Council on Redundancy Elimination remains in flux. The proliferate system designers have filed for a $65,000 government grant to scrap the whole system and start over. The Archives of Congress has offered them $70,000 not to, but they're holding out for $85,000.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Always enjoy dry, absurdist humor. All right. So that is all of our presenters today. Thank you, everybody, for coming and supporting your local writers. We hope you enjoyed this program, which will be put up on the library's YouTube channel. Our next Write Club meeting will be April 24th at 10:30 a.m. on Zoom. We also have a lovely poetry program coming up next month called Writing to Heal, led by Salam Green, founder of the Literary Healing Arts LLC. This will take place on Tuesday, April 27th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. So keep an eye out for that, as well as other great literary arts programs at the Hoover Library. That about wraps it up. Once again, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our presenters for sharing their wonderful creativity with us. We hope to see you at our next Write Club meeting or at our 2022 Flash Fiction next year.